And now we have definitely a highlight that you, as professor from Yale, who had a good prediction of the bubbles, be it the dot-com bubble 20 years ago or the housing crash. And with your analysis and the book, which I've got the German version here now, has been a topic from several people in the last hours and yesterday too. And so we are very delighted, and it's not every day, let's say that in a humble way, that we have a winner of the Nobel Prize, which you have been awarded in 2013. And so I want to save every time for maybe a short input. It's up to you, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, to present us the essential on what narrative economics is for you and why you are convinced it is so important. And afterwards, we will be very grateful to ask you a few questions if it's okay for you. You got the...
Okay, thank you. I wrote a book called Nachhaltige Wirtschaft, and ich habe Deutsch studiert, aber nicht gut genug. Ich kann nicht weitergehen. So yeah, the point of the book is that people are not constant in their thinking, and that they go through changes in their objectives and their understandings of what's going on because of changing ideas. And how do they get changing ideas? Language is a fundamental trait of the human species. I guess gorillas too, but the latest count of gorilla vocabulary of sign language, they just do only sign language, is about 100 words okay. In the wild. So, but we are a species that constantly talks. Even a newborn infant is into that a little bit. They'll meet eyes with you and they will babble to you. So it's the kind of communications that people have are not usually like the communications you'd get at a university. The university is formal and logical, whereas a typical conversation is story-based and human interest-based. So the theme of the book is that human understandings are a viral phenomenon. They're not systematic. They are contagious stories spread. And here's a link now to COVID-19. There's a theory of the contagion of diseases that has been used by epidemiologists for over 100 years. And this epidemiology is the most basic epidemiological model, called the SIR model, has two parameters: a contagion rate and a recovery rate. And an epidemic is a race between those two. And you have an epidemic when the contagion rate is higher than the recovery rate, so that new contagious people are generated faster than they get well. And this can only go on for so long, and eventually it falters. So that epidemics are typically hump-shaped. There's a rise in the number of infections and then a fall. Now, it can also have second waves or third waves. As we now know, we're seeing this happen right now. It's very hard to control these epidemics. It's even harder to control thought epidemics. Now, the idea that there are thought epidemics is not new with me. It goes way back at least back to Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist who in the 1890s published a book called, in English, The Crowd, and then coined the term crowd psychology. So it's an old idea, and it's been embraced by many people, many disciplines, except economics. Economics wants to think of the world in purely economic terms. I think it's a hazard of specialization within the university that you become loyal to your own department. It's like specialists in medicine. They tend to diagnose a disease that they are specialized in, that they know about, and you may go untreated for a long time because you didn't get the person who knows about your condition. So it's the same with these ideas. And they spread geographically, so you tend to note that there are certain areas where they have had certain beliefs for a long time. But it's becoming less geographic now with the social media, and the speed of contagion is higher. We're living in a new world now with the social media. So I kind of liken what is happening in the economy to what's happening with COVID-19. In fact, I would go on to say, as epidemiologists describe, it's a co-epidemic, in that the two epidemics interact with each other. The economic condition has something to do with our politics, and our politics are emotionally driven and have to do with stories. I keep thinking about Donald J. Trump. I suppose you've heard of this man. You've probably heard of him. That's the U.S. president, who is really very intelligent as regards marketing and getting public attention. So ideas that are controversial tend paradoxically to get elevated by epidemic thinking. Because people are always looking for new ways of proving that they're right about some political point, and they like to hear a story. So that generates false stories very often, or if not totally false, they're just misleading stories. So what I did in the book, I wanted to emphasize that there could be a study that's more systematic right now than we have now. Right, a sharp division between journalists, newspaper writers, or TV news, television news providers, and everyone else. The news providers think of themselves as far more rooted in what's going on. We observe closely what's going on now, whereas academics tend to be dwelling on the past and trying to get elegant theories and models that often conflict with elementary reality. So we have a split, and under the news media are very interested in narratives, and they spread them energetically. That's the name of the game. Whereas academics talk in this academic lingo that I think the two have to get more together to try to understand how things actually proceed. We're also living at this time in a data revolution with digitized text data coming up a lot. We have ability to search over records for what's going on now, especially, but even into the past. We can search history. So in my book, I look about past historical episodes, and I spend a lot of time reading old newspapers. Okay, I search for topics. I find often that they change their name for a topic. You have to be you have to follow a little detective work to see how they discussed it in the past. So, for example, there's a narrative about machines replacing jobs, and you might be lifetime unemployed, or you may be in dire economic straits as these new machines come on. You know how far back I traced that idea? 400 BC. Aristotle said that. But it's been taking off more recently, like 1811, when there was a famous strike of in the UK of weavers who were being replaced by machines. So we still have that coming. I would call that a recurrent narrative. When there's some great new invention, like some new agricultural harvesting machine, farm people get scared. And of course, it's true that it's hard to be a farm person. It's like 2% of the population now because it's so mechanized. But now we have a new narrative about machines, artificial intelligence replacing jobs. And that narrative is not actually particularly strong. I'm just citing it as an example at the moment. But there are new narratives, sort of a populist narrative or a narrative about other people's confidence that are spreading at this time in history. So I don't know. The book came out a year ago in English, so my ability to quote narratives since 1 year is not shown in that book. But I'm thinking about the current situation in the stock markets, particularly the U.S. stock market, because I am in the U.S., but also because it has had the most dramatic recovery since the 2009 financial crisis. So why did it do that? Why did it come up so high? I think that there isn't an agreed on explanation. If I showed you a chart, it would be like off the charts high recently. The Dow just crossed 30,000. That's been talked about as a possible event. There was a book called Dow 30,000 published in 1999. It's taken a long time to get there, but it's there now. Why would it be there right now when we're in a pandemic? And in the United States, when we have a president who is not respected by most of the population. How is it? Well, you have to put yourself in the framework of stories that people actually tell. I'm thinking that a very prominent story for people who are at least 30 years old is the story of the financial crisis from 2009 to 2007 to 2010, depends on how you define it. But in 2009, the stock markets around the world were very depressed. And I know from my surveys of public opinion then that people were afraid of a 1929 style crash in 2009. This was talked about a lot. People searched for articles about 1929 on Google Trends. You can see it on Google Trends. People were afraid that there would be a real crash and another depression coming. But you know what? It turned out to be wrong. And that is in everyone's memory. And a lot of people didn't invest in the stock market in 2009 because they feared a crash. And now they feel humiliated. They didn't get it. They didn't get it right. And so that is a narrative. It's sort of a fear of missing out narrative. Another narrative that explains the U.S. stock market is the narrative of information technology. The U.S. stock market is more heavily weighted toward information technology than any other country, maybe with the exception of China. And so that sector has become glamorous. And if people feel disappointed with value investing and they don't want to make the same, they don't want to have regret over the same mistake again. So now that might not sound like an academically pleasing description of the stock market's recent behavior, but I think it's true, and it explains it. It's not that it's the only narrative. So let me just say, and I guess I should stop soon. But I think that we need to study perennial narratives in economics, like folklore studies. People study folk tales. Remember Grimm, who talked about a compilation of folk tales in Europe? People have tried to date these folk tales, and they've found that some of them are very old, even though they weren't written down. They infer that they're very old by looking at how many different languages, different cultures tell these same folk tales. And so they're still with us. like Little Red Riding Hood. I don't know how popular that is in Germany. But they did find an exposition of that from the year 1020. That's 1,000 years ago, or 1022, I think. But I think we have to start, as folklore studies people do, they classify studies by narrative. And they find that they persist and are transformed. They have to be transformed and reborn anew with each generation to take account of the new generation's prejudices and concerns. And I think that that's what we have to think about more in economics. I haven't completed the job. I like to tell stories of, if you read my book, there's a lot of narratives that have helped drive economic activity. But economists don't want to do it because it's not their department. It's too fuzzy. You know, these literature departments that you have in universities, what do they know anyway? That's sort of the attitude among economists. It's not an exact science, but economics cannot be an exact science because it has to do with people and their feelings and what they really want. Economists don't want to talk about religion, for example, because it's not there in their model. There are some who do it, but they're very small. They don't want to talk about misunderstandings that people have of the economy and the political loyalties that people feel at different times, and the kinds of narratives that they spread that are inspirational to them or depressing to them at different times. So that's my thought, is that we have to do more of that kind of economics. I'll turn this over to questions now.
Thank you very much. As far as I'm concerned, I could listen for you for ages, but we got so many questions. And yeah, I start with two from the chat. I suppose they like me to present it to you. The first is from Mr. Dr. Schleicher. How will we get rid of the enormous amount of debt, he's asking, in the next 10 years? Will it be inflation or higher taxes or highly negative interest rates? So that's a general economic question, but in case you got an answer within a few sentences, it's up to you. Or is it impossible?
This is a narrative that's been going on for more than 100 years. The narrative is, should governments engage in debt financing and risk, and also monetary stimulus at times of a bad time? If you go back 100 years, it was a very controversial opinion that you should try to stimulate the economy in a time of depression. They didn't sound right back then, but there were some people who were saying that. We had central banks that were stimulating the economy by expanding the money stock. So for example, the 1907 crisis was famous for that. But we didn't, in the United States, we didn't even have a central bank. But it was done by J.P. Morgan, who was a central banker, a self-appointed central banker. He got banks to extend loans. So, okay. And he's still remembered today for that. So there is a sort of a revolution claimed by some people in something called modern monetary theory. And that was exposited by Professor Stephanie Kelton at Stony Brook University. And she has a new book about her view. It's called The Debt Myth, that we should be concerned about debt. Yeah. I haven't read her book, so maybe I shouldn't comment, but I'm thinking that what she's saying is not that original. It's the same refrain that we usually associate with John Maynard Keynes, that it's okay to increase the money supply when you don't have inflation. And there's a good justification when interest rates are very low for governments to borrow and spend on education, environment, infrastructure, all sorts of good things. That's the time to do it. I don't think that is that. I don't mean to dismiss Stephanie Kelton, who has influenced a lot of people, but it seems to be politically active now, modern monetary theory.
Okay. Okay.
Modern in the sense of like 1930s monetary theory.
Hmm. The next question is back to the phenomenon of narratives. Do you think, asked Mrs. Böhm, do you think that cultural differences influence the way narratives work?
Absolutely. So, you know, I'm constrained a little bit by the fact that I can't learn everything. And so I've been doing, launching to write this book had me reading much more widely than I have ever read before. So I have to read sociologists, for example, or anthropologists who have a different perspective, but it's a little bit like sociology sometimes, or psychologists. Or how about journalism schools? They have schools that teach people to write newspapers and the like. So they know a lot too, or marketing departments. So it's hard to stay on top of all these things. So I view myself as kind of an introducer. I'm trying to get the economists to listen to sociologists, and maybe sociologists to listen to economists. But you know, it's remarkable. I'm thinking of my own university about how diverse the departments that have relevance to either the current pandemic or to the narrative economics. And I've never even met these people. I suddenly read about them in the news and say, oh, this person is at my university? I never heard of him. So that's the problem. We can't all know everything. But I think that human cultural anthropology, they have their own specialists in economics. And I guess it doesn't come as close to understanding things like debt and taxation. They don't really get into that. Mm-hmm. But I think they do have inputs that could be more influential.
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, you're an advocate of a multi-perspective approach. That's the red line through the whole book, in my opinion. The next question is coming from Dr. Rose, Dr. Michael Rose, who is going to pose the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I really enjoyed your presentation, and I completely agree with what you're saying. So I'm an economist myself, and I wonder how your colleagues respond to what you are saying, right? You almost answered that question, but I think it's really interesting to learn what they tell you if you go to conferences or when you go to a seminar. And this is my first question. And the second question is, well, how can we proceed? What can we do in order to convince economists that this is really something that is important?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of difference of opinion within economics. We have a behavioral economics revolution that has taken place over the last 30 years. But it's more reading the psychology department than the sociology department. So maybe I'm more sociological. I was the elected president of the American Economic Association for 2016. So I guess I have some support among economists if they voted for me. And I gave a talk at my presidential address in 2017 entitled Narrative Economics. And I had an audience of almost 1,000 economists. And I was worried I would get booed, but I didn't. They applauded. I didn't get a standing ovation, but I got applause at the end. So I think that most academics view themselves as open to new things. And I think that young people overestimate, when you start out in an academic career, you have to get a job at a university, and then you have to get tenure. And young people are naturally afraid of doing something that it doesn't seem in the swing with what's currently being talked about. And they need to get invited to give papers at conferences, and they don't see this as something that's good. On the other hand, I've discovered that it's not quite like, I think young people exaggerate the constraints on their research. I had the experience as placement officer for our PhD program some years ago, and I was trying to sell our economists, new young economists, on other professors who would call up saying, who do you have to hire this year? And I found that they were thinking much more like me, or they're much more interested in original thinkers than you would suspect. A lot of research gets humdrum after a while, and there's too many papers on this topic. So my general advice to young scholars is be adventuresome. You might get thrown out of academia for a while. That's what happened, by the way, to Albert Einstein, who, when he got his PhD at, where was it, Zurich, he got no job offers, and he had to work as a clerk in the patent office in Switzerland. But he prevailed eventually, so maybe taking a long-term view is the right thing to do.
Thank you very much. If I get the order right, then it's up to Mr. Ruckriegel for the next question.
Do you hear me?
I hear you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm totally impressed by your work, and I'm following it up during the last 20, 30 years, whatever. And I already read your book about narrative economics. Very a wonderful book. The question is, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman developed this dual action system, which means system 1 and system 2. The question is, Kahneman wrote this very famous book in 2011, Fasting, Slow Singing. And the question is, how do you make use in your thinking of this dual action system, which is, from my point of view, very valuable to understand people with the limbic system, the neocortex, whatever, and the working together on the one hand, and on the other hand, what do you think, what is the percentage of economists in the United States who have understood or who is dealing with this dual action system in their theories? For example, Richard Thaler is doing very intensively working on this. But what do you think, what is the percentage of economics in the United States who has realized the importance of this dual action system as the basis of our thinking?
Yes, I was thinking about this. How far back does this system, system 1 and system 2, just to repeat, these are terms used by Danny Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If you're in a crowd of people and you note out of the corner of your eye that someone has just entered the room, you just look in a glance, you will know who it is. If it's someone you know, you'll recognize instantly. Mm-hmm. How did you do that? That's the underlying system of processing that's subconscious. Your brain just reports to you, that's Joe Schmo, you know him. Yeah. But how can the brain do that? You see him in a different lighting and a different perspective, and he might have a funny expression on his face. You can see through all that and identify him positively. And they try to figure out how fast you can do that. I think for facial, they would blink on a screen, to see how fast you could recognize a face. I think you can do it in, I don't remember, it was something like 1/10 of a second, some fraction of a second. You are so fast to do that. And you have no idea how you do that. And that's the reflex system. Then there's the conscious system, which relates to what you actually are thinking about. And that's what we're aware of. But now this is not, I'm a big admirer of Danny Kahneman, but I have to say it's not entirely a new idea. I was quite surprised to find it. I was reading a book written by Walter Bagehot, who was editor of The Economist magazine in London for many years in the mid-19th century, like around when was this? The book was around, maybe it was in the 1850s. So his book is called Physics and Politics. Okay? And he's trying to bring a scientific basis to political and economic understanding. And at one point, this is 1850s. He says, how do you talk anyway? You have to move muscles in your face and your tongue. Do you think about moving those muscles? Do you even know what those muscles are? You have no idea. You just talk and you don't know how it's happening. So that's Kahneman's thesis, and it goes way back. To me, it's the idea that I get from reading these people is that it's very important to be a generalist and to be a so-called Renaissance person. So I think that Bagehot is still admired today. His book, Physics and Politics, will not be assigned because it has some racist elements in it. It sounds, by our modern ears, racist. But I think Bagehot is an admirable guy. He can't be clean by our standards completely. But it seems to me that reading and understanding widely is, and reading about System 1 and System 2. I assigned that book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, to my class because I thought it was an important book. It has a lot in it. There's a lot of complexity to our minds. We have to understand, we can't develop purely abstract economic models without paying attention to the complexity that's really there.
What a true word, I would say. The next question is from Thomas Kries. Do not trust the government.
Yeah,
why is it the most common narrative in the US?
Yeah, my question, let me put a bit more input in that question. So I know that there are time series about trust in the government for 50 years. And you see that these time series started with 70% trust in the government after Second World War up to something like 20% right now. And we're talking about narratives and what narratives do with people. And therefore my question is, do you have an idea what kind of narrative in the US led to these kind of massive loss in trust to the US government or to governments in general? So what is the narrative on that?
Well, I think that narrative is spread by contagion. And it, as a theme in my book, it's very hard for most of us to understand what is contagious, what is going to be contagious. It's a mystery. These things, new ideas keep coming up mysteriously. So right now, the key idea that I see in the United States is that the mainstream news media is corrupt. It has been taken over by George Soros and other internationalists who want to sell out America. They hate America and they want to destroy America. Now that sounds nutty to me, but you know, actually nutty narratives have a particular power because they're contagious. People like to say things that are surprising and interesting, and so they spread like wildfire. So I think the actual explanation for the loss of, if you think that the mainstream media and the universities are all corrupt and lying in a conspiracy against the American people, that they hate America and want to destroy it, if you believe that, then you must be open to all kinds of things. I have relatives who are strong Trump supporters, and I can't understand them. But there are apparently 70 million of them in America. Where do they come from? I talk to them and try to reason with them, and I find that they're very interested in talking with me. But they're always trying to prove me wrong. They're trying to come up with something. They say, "Isn't it obvious? Go to a Trump rally. You've never even done that. Go to a Trump rally, and you'll feel the spirit and the excitement." And it's obvious that Trump won the election because of my own thoughts, my own observations. But I tend to think of these phenomena as difficult to explain until we understand better what makes particular narratives appealing. Now, it's partly, I think, in the United States, Trump is support. A lot of people, only 40% of our young people have college degrees in the United States. So the other 60% are feeling kind of ignored. The term "forgotten man" has come back. And they like to think we're the people doing all the hard work and you don't appreciate us. we put your breakfast on the table and we repair your house, and you're disrespectful of us. And that's the underlying emotion that combines with other narratives. It's like a perfect storm that these people now feel that they've bonded with the ideas, and they think that their self-esteem is dependent on their being true. They can't back down and say they were all wrong about Trump. We have to just kind of let this pass and forget about it. And maybe in 30 years, we'll be okay.
Okay, thank you very much. You've got still time for a few questions more, Mr. Shiller?
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Then it's up to Professor Silja Graupe, who is doing her presentation tomorrow in the morning. Bitte, Frau Graupe.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's up to me to talk about a couple of things tomorrow, so just to talk after you. And what I'm interested in, that you're saying that economics is not interested in narratives, which I agree. But don't you think that economics is creating powerful narratives?
Right.
As you talk in your book, Fishing for Fools, and you say it's such a powerful rhetoric, but talking that all our life is like being in a supermarket and dealing with apples and oranges. And I use this example you give quite a lot, because I think all these ideas of a powerful market, which we cannot explain, but which we take like a narrative for all our lives. I think it's such an interesting topic you make. So I would like you to talk shortly about the question of how economics itself is creating narratives without explaining it.
Yeah, well, some economists do that. People who are naturally gifted storytellers do that. I think it's more the journalists who do that. So we have economic narratives that I find hard to trace to an academic. So for example, there's a supply side economics. I don't know if that term is used much in Germany, but it came up with Ronald Reagan. Well, they like to attach a celebrity figure to it. So our President Reagan was attached to the supply side economic. So the story, it appeals intellectually to people who feel like they're forgotten and taken for granted. So it says, all this Keynesian stuff about the government borrowing money and lending it out to keep the economy strong. What you have to do is tell people that we won't take it away from you. That's the most important thing. If you work hard and make a lot of money, we won't confiscate it like the communists do. And so then it gives you the term incentivize became much more popular in the last 40 years or so. In other words, people respond to incentives. That's an essential reality. That isn't just a narrative, it's partly true. But it became embellished and stronger under Ronald Reagan. He was a quotable guy. He had a different personality than Donald Trump, a totally different personality. But it was a narrative that's, and also Margaret Thatcher and others still at that time. But those didn't really originate with economists, not academic economists who are skeptical and want to see facts and figures and charts and diagrams. It originated with Jude Wanniski, for example, who was a Wall Street Journal writer who wrote a book about supply side economics. So, but it all has to link into some basic identity issue. So the identity issue, again, which I think infects much of the world now, and it ties in with the narrative that I mentioned about machines replacing jobs. There are a lot of people who are worried about their future, thinking, I don't know where I fit in this world, which seems to be increasingly dominated by hotshot young techie types that I went to college and I can't compete with them. And they're making machines that replace me. And they don't even care about me. They make jokes about me. That's the feeling that has propelled both the Reagan narrative and the Trump narrative. Trump likes to borrow anything that works, and he takes ideas from Ronald Reagan without attributing them. Make America Great Again, for example, was a Ronald Reagan slogan.
Okay, thanks very much. Then the next question is to my colleague who is organizing this little conference, Marcus. It's up to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Shiller. It's a pleasure to listen to your thesis. I got a question. We already had one question: how to convince economists to be more active in the domain of narrative economics. And now let's assume that we are successful with that, and that for me, I'm really convinced. And now I like to start with doing research in the area of narrative economics. And when I look at your book, you did it in such a variety of ways how you collected your information. So you said in taxis, for example, in churches, you looked at sources like in historian. So it was really, you mentioned the disciplines, the knowledge of disciplines you need to know. What would you recommend as a toolbox or of a systematic way to do that in a systematic way from a methodological point of view?
I'm still thinking about that. I thought the readers of my book would mostly not be academic economists, so I didn't. It is still a kind of an academic book, but when I'm talking to my students in class, I think of them as going out on different trajectories, and they have to learn different. We still have to tilt our reading in one direction or another. I'm in favor of trying to become a generalist and reading about all branches of knowledge. But one has to think about how one will be viewed in the world and what kind of narrative that you are creating of yourself. This requires some specialization. Now, the university departments, division of labor across departments makes life difficult for generalists. Unfortunately, it's been lamented now for about 100 years. I think there was more, as the universities grew in size, they began to becoming more departmental in their focus. And you didn't have to appeal to the sociologists. You could ignore them completely. They don't matter over here. So it makes it difficult. You also, you get graduates, as a researcher, you get graduate students who come in because of their perception of economics of the past. Often in economics, we often get graduate students, I believe, who like mathematics, but don't like physics, or for some reason, they don't see themselves going that way. So economics attracts them. So they're hard to convince. They should be doing something like sociology. But I don't know. So there is, various university presidents have tried to create a more unified university. This goes, there must be a long history of this. I don't have it all in mind. They'll create coffee hours, interdepartmental coffee hours, or something like that. Or they'll have interdepartmental majors for undergraduates that bring faculty together around their students. But I think there is actually going to be an increased attention to narratives because of the increased ability to search digitized text. What I would like to see economists do is get more involved in running focus groups where they can learn, as politicians do now. This is how you get elected now. You get a focus group is a group of people who come together, who are brought together by a leader and asked to talk in a group about some politically important thing. And if you do it right, you get them at ease. So they're not afraid of being quoted. They feel like they're among their own people. And they'll come out and say things that might sound, these people matter. That's why in the last two Trump elections, we had a surprise that the vote went much more for Trump than we thought. So apparently a lot of people like Trump, but feel they can't say it. And that's why it was such a surprise when Trump got elected, because nobody is talking to me about Trump. favorably. But maybe it's partly geographical. I live in New England, part of the US, where, but I'm talking to my relatives in Detroit, and they're out in the countryside. I'm retired relatives of mine, and they are really in Republican territory. But you put them together and let them talk without censure. And and if it's a skilled leader, you can direct the conversation where they reveal what they really think.
Thank you. I see two more questions in a comment. The next is Mrs. Dr. Mengel. Do you want to pose it yourself?
It was essentially the same like the last question. So
okay. Okay. Thanks very much.
You.
Then the answer is given. Then Mr. Rupert.
Yes. Hello. Very good afternoon to the US. Hello. I have a question. I would like to take up your thought about the how did you put it? You said the forgotten man.
Yeah.
Forgotten man. Like, isn't there currently, at least in around about 50% of the US population, a kind of a narrative which is kind of, let me put it, dark, which is hopeless, which is dire, which relates to this dark man, to this forgotten man, you know. And I think while Obama years back actually countered that with a positive narrative, Trump completely switched to a negative narrative. Bad China, bad deep state. Yeah, it's all the all the bad all bad news, bad stories. It's a kind of a scary tale, actually, a scary tale.
Right.
Framed, I think. And now it's about the politics in Biden to maybe reframe a positive narrative and bring back hope. But my question would be to you as an economist: how do you feel the economy will react to this, or how do you feel like we should go ahead and deal with this 50% maybe of the people, and similar in Europe also, being forgotten and have a dire feeling? And how do you think this will develop, this narrative?
That's a big question. I'll think about that. Call me in 3 more years. Maybe I'll have thought something more about that. Yeah, how do we generate? You know, the inspirational figures at various times in history have caused major historical changes. Like in the United States in 1776, there was a totally new idea spread like wildfire across the country, that we should be a United States of America. And the idea that kings and queens are nobodies, really. You've been tricked all your life to think that their royalty means something. Of course, it means nothing. It's just birth, order of birth. It doesn't mean anything. They were right, by the way. But it was a new narrative. Thomas Paine wrote a book in 1776 called Common Sense, and he said that. And it was a bestseller. It sold, I don't know how many copies. Everybody read it, even in that remote time in history. It was hugely successful. So what did he get right? So I looked at his, you can read it if you want. It's on, you can find it on the web. It's past copyright. He tells a lot of stories, but they're biblical stories in accord with his time. People were very Christian in colonial America. And so if you want to get their interest, you tell biblical stories. And he interprets the Bible as suggesting that we have a God-supported campaign ahead of us to form a separate country. So I think that there's something that, you know, we have human talents. It's called what's the word? Intelligence. I can't think of the word. By a number of authors recently. Emotional intelligence is what it's called.
Yep.
Some people are more adept at seeing. It's just like when I mentioned you could recognize a face coming into the room in 1/10 of a second, you can also recognize people's mindsets and study their faces and understand their reactions at an emotional level, and part of our brain that's not logical or rational. I think Donald Trump is great at this. He knows how to read your face. But I heard him speak only once, and that was at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And he totally changed for the audience. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't one of his rallies. He sounded almost convincing. And I only heard boos once or twice from that audience. So he has the kind of, it has to do with music too. Some music is great music. But what is it about it? Could you define it and have a computer recognize what is great music? They haven't done it yet. And I suspect it's going to be modeling a part of our brain that's very hard to, at the present time, to understand. So I think people go to journalism schools, they go to public policy schools, they go to marketing schools as a way of learning about people. And ultimately, our governments tend to be led by people who have this talent. I think we can bring it out a little bit more if we talk about it. But in the end, it's going to be still partly inscrutable.
Thank you. We are already way over the time we asked, Phil, so I will take the 2 last comments or question. Mr. Vollbracht, who is research director for Media Tenor in Switzerland and did the presentation yesterday. You got the word.
Thank you. So one suggestion for all of us to read Walter Lippmann, 1922, Public Opinion. He talks about the pictures in our heads and minds. And that is exactly, I think, what we have all discussed this evening. And thank you very much for your ideas, indeed. The more formal way to approach this has been trained by media communication scholars for the past 50 years empirically. It was part of my presentation last night on news value and news value factors. And I think it can be very helpful for us. I'm a trained economist as well, besides being a media scholar. And so using that type of data in a more systematical way can obviously help us to trace the narratives and trace the stories and get them in some way into our models. We are currently working with the University of Florence in Italy on a paper about the impact of the economic narrative on fertility rates. And the results are very promising, that we have explanatory power in the narrative, in the economic narrative on the fertility rate in Italy post-financial crisis. So I think that there are many ways to have this kind of shared journey to benefit from that. I would strongly agree to your argument. We should be interdisciplinary rather than just be kind of simple-minded. And the phenomenon that you just mentioned with the invisible Donald Trump supporters was already described by Professor Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann in the 80s. Then with Chancellor Helmut Kohl and his supporters. So the same thing, they were invisible and everyone was surprised that he was elected. She called it the spiral of silence.
Awesome.
Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann would be a good read in that context as well. I think she explained this phenomenon quite well. But if you're interested in working with data on narratives, we have tons of data collected, even with US TV news shows. So I would be happy to share with you if you're interested in.
Yeah, if you could email me with some links, that would be good.
For sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I forgot to mention communication school. I mentioned journalism, but Yale doesn't have a communication school. That's why I left that out.
Yeah.
Okay, then the last question is up to Dr. Schleich, who worked for the Bavarian government. I hope I'm allowed to say that. It's up to you.
Professor Shiller, if I understood you right, you said that true academic economists normally are not narrative economists, but mostly politicians and journalists. would you agree that narratives are often driven by the interests of groups?
Narratives are driven by the interests of groups.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people tell stories that seem to have nothing interesting or exciting in them, except that they advance the cause of a group. So what comes into my mind is in the United States, as an example of a narrative that everybody knows. And I'll tell it to you very briefly. When George Washington was 12 years old, he, without permission, cut down a cherry tree on his father's estate. And the father came to him angrily saying, "You cut down that cherry tree?" And then George said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree." End of narrative. Now, what's good about that narrative? I don't see anything interesting or good about it. The reason they do that is it's a patriotic moment, and it's a way of teaching honesty that everybody hears. I just told it to you too. I don't know if you've heard it all the way over in Germany, but maybe you have. It's been an active narrative for over 200 years. So. It doesn't have to be a good or strong. It has to be contagious, and they're contagious because in this case, it fits in with your group. It teaches patriotism. In this case, for the United States, and that's one of the motivations you have to tell a story, to confirm that we're in this together. We're a group, and that's why it amazes me when I talk to my relatives in Detroit who are Trump supporters. It amazes me. They pick up every single element of the Trump line they are convinced about every single thing that man says. I don't know how they can be convinced that he keeps changing his story, but they seem to be convinced by the latest story. So it has something to do with loyalty. It's a strong human sentiment, I think.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shiller, for your precious time, for answering the question. There have been several economists from different universities around Germany, so I'm quite sure that this event will make at least a small contribution to bring the idea of narrative economics further on, to enhance the idea of interdisciplinary, and the sentence which struck me most and convinced me on the first listening was that you said we cannot think economics as a science of facts, since human beings, people are more than precise, are more than systematic. We are much more emotions, pictures, everything. So thank you very much for your precious time. I think if any one of us hadn't read the book so far, it's going to be now. And in this case, I send warm regards to Yale over the big ocean. And okay. we will then continue our conference tomorrow in the morning and a bit tonight too. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Es war ein Vergnügen für mich.
Das Vergnügen ist unsererseits.
Okay.
Bye. All the best.
Bye.
Thank you very much.